Hey, praise the Lord, guys. I'm Straw Greenhorn. Now there sat by some of the scribes that reasoned within their hearts, saying, "Why does this man speak blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God alone?" And Jesus immediately perceived in his spirit that they thus so reasoned among themselves. He said, "Wherefore think ye these things in your heart? Whether is it easier to say unto the sick of the palsy, Thy sins be forgiven thee, or arise, take up thy bed and walk? But that thou should know that the Son of Man have power on earth to forgive sins. He saith unto the sick of the palsy, I say unto thee, arise, take up thy bed, and go thy way to thine own house. And immediately he took up his bed, and he left in view of all those that stood by. And they marveled greatly and praised God, saying, We have never seen it, not like this before, not after this fashion. So a continuation really from the last video. Here we see this is where we're still in Capernaum, right? So he was gathered in a house, and they brought unto him, well, assembled at the door of the house. There was not even room enough to receive them. Pretty much the whole city. And there was one lying in the bed sick of a palsy, born of four. And when they couldn't get to him, they uncovered the roof where he was and let down the sick, the palsy in the bed. And when he saw them, he said, he saw their faith and said, thy sins be forgiven thee. So, here's my question. The scribes and Pharisees, they hate him so much, but yet still, here they are, within, earshot, obviously enough to hear what he said. Start, reasoning in their hearts. They were trying to, disprove everything he said. They always had something to say. Why are they there listening to all this? That's the obvious question that nobody, wants to ask. You guys, you feel, a way about everything he does. Why are you there? They're there to watch him commit acts of greatness that they're going to despise, because if there was not room enough in this house to receive all the people that they had to come to the roof, then how did they get a seat in there? Because you gotta understand that he was there in this house. He obviously knew the person who owned the house. It was not mentioned the name of the person or whose house it is, or even his relationship with this person. It just says that he was there in the house, so that this was a private gathering. So how did the scribes and Pharisees get wind of all this for them to be inside the house? They obviously beat the crowd there, because there's a lot of people that surrounded this thing, and they're inside so that they could hear what he said. Because remember, he's inside the house. Those outside, they can't really. I would imagine they can't really hear, because it says that there was not room enough to receive them, not even at the door. How did they get wind before everybody else to make it in the house? In order for them to be inside, they had to be one of the first ones there. But here they are, yet again complaining, finding fault. It just goes to show that sometimes your biggest haters will be the ones closest to you. They're not there to support. They're just there to keep close enough to see what you're doing, so that they can fight against it, pray against it, sabotage. So here we see him really addressing the statement that he made. He made a completely bold statement here. Thy sins be forgiven thee. And that would naturally lead you to ask the question, how comes you're saying this? What gives you the right to say something like this? And he does address this. He says that so that you know that I have power on earth to forgive sins. You got to understand, the scribes and Pharisees, when they taught, they basically read from the law of Moses, and they would expound, clarify, each thing individually. Like for example, they had a law that says, "Thou shalt not sow thy field with diverse seeds." Pretty much saying that if you had a field with crops growing, it all had to be the same. You can't have like corn mixed with grapes. Not saying that those would ever even be able to grow together, but you understand, you can't have two different things growing. You can't have apples and oranges growing together. It all has to be of those the same. So they didn't have the insight that he had, because this is a new thing. It's a new covenant, and things that are new is new. It's not a restating of the old. And he is the way, the truth, and the life. And God sent him to bring this doctrine, to bring this new testament. So they really had nothing, no expectation. And they were so, when they studied the law, you could see that they did it for the rules and the regulations. They did it for the ceremonies. They did it for the things that you should do. They didn't look towards the prophecies. They didn't look towards Isaiah said that he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. Chastisement of our peace was upon him. By his stripes we are healed. It didn't look to coming, so much as how they focus on the law. And this is what really got them in trouble. The fact that he should come and be betrayed, crucified, and died, that they should part his raiment among them. I mean, these were all people that should have at least, heard, these, things at least once in their life. But yet still they took and parted, his garments when he was crucified. Wisdom would say you would want to try and stay out of that, right? So what I'm getting at is that they didn't use the law of Moses to look for the future events that would happen. to avoid falling, for these things. So here they are in this house. They hear him say this, and they start, questioning the reasoning. They focus on, how you should live. But even that they got wrong. Because, the law of Moses says, that no man can claim to be God, no man can blaspheme God. And, here Jesus is making these statements. So that's what, they reached out on, instead of realizing that, hey, the Messiah, he is to come one day. And the things that Jesus was doing, this is a pretty good hint that, this is him. This is a pretty good, allusion to the fact that, this might just very well be the Messiah. But, they were so grounded in the rules. The rules, they were so grounded in rules. They were all about the rules. But yes, they couldn't even live up to those because Jesus, he was always grieved with them. He said, you love to pray standing on the street corners, in long robes. When you fast, you disfigure your faces. You pray saying many words, thinking that you will be heard. You devour widows' houses. You know what it is to devour a widow's house. Her husband has died and he has left, her whatever she has. And now, in those days, women really didn't work, so she had to make this, serve her. And here you are coming, stealing this widow's, income. Pretty much her whatever she has to left to live off. I mean, how cruel you have to be to do something like you encompass land and sea to find one proselyte, one disciple. When you find him, you make him a twofold more child of hell than yourself. And on one of my videos, I say that they just pass down all their misconceptions. The person before them, they had some misconceptions. They taught it to them. So now they, in their walk, they, notice and observe certain things, and they develop also misconceptions. So now this third person gets two different sets of misconceptions, and then when they find their proselyte, they will pass on their misconceptions plus these other two for three misconceptions, and it just keeps going like that. So now here we see them really being, I want to say stuck, observing rules. That's how they think. If you look at them and you observe them, why does this man speak blasphemies? Rules. They can't, like I said, they can't look to the prophecies, look to the future to expect, to receive, the Christ. That was their downfall. All right, so let's get into these scriptures. It starts out saying, and some of the scribes that sat by, they reasoned, within their hearts. So now here they are sitting, listening to him preach, watching him heal and do his thing. He just, well, it doesn't really say that, he didn't receive his healing yet. This man, he received the sick of the bed, the sick of the palsy lying in the bed. He was healed after Jesus addressed, these scribes. So, he was setting it up because, sometimes when you throw something out there because you want to bring light to it so that a question could be asked so that you could clarify it. That's what Jesus was doing here. He threw the bait out there that, thy sins be forgiven thee. So most naturally, he was waiting for somebody to ask or to bring it up, and these guys, they did. But their heart, it was always in the wrong place, and they're going to hold this against him and use it as a reason to destroy him and to persecute, after him. So they were sitting in there and they were reasoning in their heart. They heard this, so they were paying attention to everything that he said. And all the good things that he said, all the the wonderful things, they would skip over all of those things, and then they will find this. At this point, I wonder if they were looking at him to see if they could recruit him, to their team to preach with them, or if they were, just looking to learn or to observe. Throughout the whole, gospel, we always see them, watching him. I don't think I've ever seen in the gospel where, they were teaching and he was, there listening to them. We know that at one point, when he was younger, they gave him something to read and he read, and then all eyes were fastened on him when he gave the book back. So, in that instance, somebody else was teaching, but nothing was said about what they taught or what was said. Only thing we ever see is him teaching and them observing and finding fault, right? So they sat there and they reasoned in their hearts, saying, why does this man speak blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God alone? So, they thought it in their hearts. They didn't say it out loud. So now Jesus, he's able to answer, his own question or his own statement rather. Because you remember when they were crucifying him, King Herod, even the high priest, they would always ask him, tell us plainly, art thou the Christ? And he would always say, thou hast said. But here, is an answer. Obviously they forgot, this moment, but there's many moments they did not forget. They didn't forget when he said, destroy this temple and I will raise it up again in 3 days. They accused him of that. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, render unto God. They accused him of not wanting them to pay tribute to Caesar. But this moment, yeah, they didn't remember this one, because here he is saying, why does this man speak blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God alone? I said, now here's the moment that he's looking to impart knowledge and wisdom and understanding. I know it's up to them, what they will do with it. They can use it to learn and mix everything that they're seeing, all his words, all his miracles, and they can use that to build faith. Or they can use it to harden themselves and develop a coarse, skin with a scalp that cannot be, penetrated Because you see, in this moment, they had a choice. They had a choice to grow with him and to receive him, or to use all these things to develop a callus, a thickened skin. If you know a callus, for those that do embroidery and sewing, by hand, when they hold the needle, over time the skin gets hardened. Even certain athletes, when they run, they develop, calluses on their feet. Whatever it is that you do that's physical, you're gonna develop a callus. So here they are, using his words to harden their hearts. And the moment is set from this point, because at this time, at this point, they decided that they don't like him, and now we're gonna take everything that he says, in this window, this fashion, that he's a false teacher and a blasphemer. He is, he's not the real deal. So then it says, then Jesus immediately perceived in his spirit and said, wherefore reason ye these things in your heart? Whether is it easy to say to the sick of the palsy, thy sins be forgiven thee, or arise, take up thy bed and walk? So he perceived in his spirit, so they didn't say it out loud. So this right here, this was like a window opening with sunshine, coming through it, sun rays. That's kind of that beautiful scenery that it just makes you feel at peace and at home when he answers them, because they should ask the question, how does this man know what we're thinking? This was really an intimate moment for them. Wherefore think you these things in your heart? This was when they were supposed to awaken that childlike reaction, to believe. If you ever seen a little child, they'll just sit there, and then you come to them with whatever, and they'll play whatever game you want, whatever activity. They'll just sit there and be entertained by you, pretty much, and they'll do it so innocently. This was their moment. Wherefore think you these things in your heart? But instead, we already started going down that road of disbelief and hardening our skins. So now everything that he does, they're going to use it to feed this hardening of their heart. They didn't just get to hating him like they wanted to kill him, overnight. It was all these things, building up, building up, building up. So like I said, at some point they had a choice, and they chose to go with hardening the hearts. But sometimes things in life happen so automatic, and you don't realize that something is growing inside you. You don't realize that you made a decision to feel a certain way about a certain thing, and then it just gets worse and worse and worse. Whether is it easy to say to the sick of the palsy, thy sins be forgiven thee, or arise, take up thy bed and walk? I could easily tell him to arise, take up his bed and walk, but I said it just so that you would know that the Son of Man have power on earth to forgive sins also. This was done to get you guys up to speed. Don't use it to harden your heart. I'm proving step by step. The Bible says line upon line, precept upon precept. Here a little, there a little. Here a little, there a little. I'm showing you all things. I'm slowly feeding you. Everything that you need to receive me. You notice I didn't start telling you that I am the Son of God who have power to forgive sins. No, I gave you miracles. I cleansed the leper, opened the eyes of the blind, the deaf. I mean, how awesome was that? Then I gave unto you words of wisdom that you never heard before. Last of all, here I am. I'm telling you that I have power on earth to forgive sins, because I am the Son of God. He really did lay it out the best way he could. Because if he had just came out in the beginning saying I am the Son of God, then they would have thought he was crazy. I mean, it wouldn't even be a chance of them resisting him. They would have just dismissed him as a crazy person. They wouldn't have, built up, this hardened heart, because they would have seen it as a joke, ridiculous. But he did what he could for them, I believe, because he laid everything out simple, easy, simple by simple. This was done so that that the Son of Man have power on earth to forgive sins also. We'll see him giving this to the disciples later. Whosoever sin you retain shall be retained. Whosoever sin you forgive shall be forgiven. But I really don't think that ministers and preachers should practice this in this day and age. The reason I say that is because there's so much deception, there's so much manipulation, and people are doing all the things for all the wrong reason. Imagine if people were to start taking advantage of this command, they would use it to manipulate people, to do what they wanted. Because I find that there's a lot of manipulation, for all the wrong reasons. You see a lot of televangelists, doing this, saying that if you don't give, then and they pronounce all kind of curses on people. So far he's been solid on everything: the healings, the deliverances, the wisdom. The whole multitude was just captivated by him. They never seen anything like this before, and no matter what, they wouldn't believe. They got so used to their way of living and being. If they were to receive these things, then it would change them, because they would begin to walk in love. They would have to stop doing a lot of the things that they do to manipulate people and steal and take from them. They would have to be, pure and honest and genuine people. But they were just interested in dishing out rules and doing things for a show. Accepting this, would have changed them. And change can be sometimes the scariest thing. Because then if they couldn't steal from the people, devouring widows' houses and all the other things they were doing. Because everything had came about, what you possessed and what you had. That's why he said a man's life consisteth not in the things wherein he possesses, because it was all about what you owned. And that goes into in hand with the parable he gave about, unless you enter in as little children, you shall in no wise enter in. But these two things are what's in conflict right now. Like I said, being that little child, being genuine, authentic, not seeing people for what you can gain from them, not deceiving, not manipulating, not controlling people to do usually what you want, and something that has nothing to do with anything that God ever asked for. But doing this, you're probably not gonna get rich. Because remember, he was always saying that you guys love the chief, seats in the synagogues and the upper rooms at feasts. These things come to those who have the most usually. And that's why he gave the parable about, when you keep that feast and the rich man come in gay clothing, if you give him a high seat and then the poor, beggar man comes in to find a seat, and you tell him to sit, here at your footstool, that then you have become partial in judgment. That's why he said this. So this was done so that you would know that the Son of Man had power on earth to forgive sins. So then he said unto the sick of the palsy, I say unto thee, arise, take up thy bed, and go thy way to thine own house. So we hadn't seen him healed yet. So that all this was done to educate the people. So he said that, so that you would think, and then get your mind right to where it needs to be. But only God himself can forgive sins. That's right where I want you. All right, so now he says unto the sick, arise, take up thy bed and walk. Like I said in my last video, because if he healed them when he said that sins be forgiven, then people would wonder that, well, maybe it's because he sinned. Remember, he was born like this. But then they could say that, well, maybe his parents sinned. So here Jesus is giving the reason. So just so that you know the Son of Man have power on earth to forgive sins. So arise, take up thy bed. Remember, they let him through the roof. So they let him down by a cord. And now, seeing this man come through your roof, I wonder whose house it was. Like I said in my last video, he probably left a leak, right? In time it rained, I'm pretty sure that they didn't patch it perfectly, and then maybe parts of it would leak. So then he arose and took up his bed and left in view of all those that watched him. And they marveled greatly, glorifying God, saying, we never saw it like this before, not after this fashion. So he took up his bed and left. Now, we know that a lot of the people that were healed, they were all in the public. They were known greatly by the public. Blind Bartimaeus that sat by the wayside begging, man that was, demon possessed, crying and cutting himself in the tombs, that he cast those devils out into the pigs, swine. A lot of these people, they were known, but it doesn't really say if anybody knew this guy, if he was one to be inside the house always. Because he had the palsy, he couldn't really move around. Was he also a beggar? Because usually you see them begging by the wayside. All right, so when he was let down, they saw that he was sick of the palsy, because it said that it glorified God greatly, saying they never saw it in this fashion before. So what these scribes have learned from this encounter, is how to harden their hearts, even further. Because he answered them, he gave them the answer, and he followed it up with a very powerful healing. Here's all the reasons to believe. So this is one of the beginnings of them hardening their hearts. Because remember, at first they didn't know anything about him. So the first thing he did, they were faced with a question: are we gonna believe or not? And then they watched him and watched him, saw the healings, the deliverance, and they heard him speak. But then maybe they were unsure what way to lean. Maybe they even were on the fence. But then these statements is what sealed the deal for them to not believe, saying that, just so you know that I have the power on earth to forgive sins. Because it would get worse and worse. If you notice, by the time it got to when he cast out that devil, and they said, he only cast devils out by Beelzebub. So you know that they had been seeing enough things now and building up within themselves hate. Hate is really what it was, and unbelief. So now that when they saw him do that, they actually came up with a reason why. You see, you only do that because you yourself are a devil, is what they said. So you can see them, gaining ground inside their own minds against him. And it started out very small, and it just, got worse and worse and worse. And like I always like to say, the kicker, the final straw, was when he asked them that parable about David. The Lord said unto my Lord, sit thou at my right hand till I make thy enemies thy footstool. If David called him Lord, how then is he his son? He couldn't answer the riddle, and it said from after that, they never asked him anything else. That shut them up completely. They were embarrassed, and all we see after that is them plotting. I am Straw Greenhorn.